recorded live.
Hello and welcome to the Castle of Horror interview segment where we talk to writers and creators of today's genre worlds. From Denver, Colorado, I'm your host, Jason Henderson, creator of the Alex Van Helsing novels. This week we're talking to Michael Aronovitz, author of the new book, Witch of the Wood, from Hippocampus Press. Is that how you say that, Hippocampus Press?
Uh-huh.
Hippocampus. All right. Michael began publishing collections and novels in 2009, very recently, through Centipede Press, Dark Renaissance Books, Hippocampus Press, and Horrified Press. And there's definitely a trend of horror there. And this November, his first young adult piece will come out through Vinspire Press, and his third novel, Phantom Effect, will be published by Nightshade Books this February. And we're here talking about Witch of the Wood, which I have, and I have to confess, I have read really the first half of Witch of the Wood, but I'm really enjoying it, and I'm feeling it is a creepy, disturbing, very, very erotic kind of book, and I hope you're proud of it. So I want to talk to you about this, Michael. First of all, this book, Witch of the Wood, where does this fit into your writing in general? I mean, how do you come to write this particular novel?
Yeah, what a great question. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, I don't know where it fits because it's bizarre. All of my other stuff was kind of different. And this one, you know how you ask the what-if question? Right. What if this were to happen? I wonder what the domino effect would be. With Witch of the Wood, the domino effect just went crazy. And it started out being something to deal with the idea that guys are fickle. And in relationships, in relationships after the initial passion wears off, and you're calling each other every night saying, I love you, no, you hang up first, no, you. After about maybe 6 months of that, a year and a half, guys wander. And I thought, what would it be like if there was an ancient race of women who could shapeshift according to the given male's evolving sexual desire?
Right.
And I thought, wow, I've got an idea. And if I'm going to do a witch, she's going to be sexy. And I didn't want to do anything like witch porn or anything like that, but I wanted to add a feature of erotica to really make the read fly. But then, we got to the point of, well, where are they now? Okay, spoiler alert, guys. They're buried under the trees. They can't get out. Every witch that tries to get out is a shadow and a dead witch, and the spell can't be broken. And then what happens if it was broken? Jason, do you know how many trees there are in the world?
No, but there's actually a point when just to bring the listener up to speed, you're talking about that, there's this race of witches, and here witches with a capital W means essentially this sort of like a very early demonic sort of entire race, a magical race, almost sprite-like in a sense. And they conform to men's sexual desires, and then they were somehow at some point they became the trees. I love the fact that they are the tree. Am I understanding that correctly? Like every tree out there is actually a captured witch?
It's partially just a prison stalk. And then when the witches come out, all the trees have to fall down. And I actually had to research it. There are over 400 million trees in the world. So I was figuring if the witches come out, not only is it, the day where the shapeshifters come out and start playing those kind of games, but also it's an apocalypse. Every tree comes down, something bad is going to happen. Then all of a sudden there are going to be religious issues. There's going to be nativity issues. We don't want them in our bloodline kind of thing. And, when you think about it, when you get back to the witch as an archetype or a concept, I guess the most famous attractive witches, you have to go back to the 90s. It's like the Witches of Eastwick and The Craft. Yeah. And then you go to how we view witches now. Macbeth started it, but they had beards and they were ugly. And then you have the Wizard of Oz, and she's green. And then you have the Blair Witch, and you never see her. So I thought, I'm going to make sexy witches.
Although in the Wizard of Oz, Glinda uses that word, witch, and she goes,
oh my God, I forgot about her.
She goes, are you a good witch or are you a bad witch? and I think that was, but to be honest with you, that was like 1938 or something. But to be honest with you, that was about as sophisticated, and I'm not completely being sarcastic, but that was as sophisticated as our understanding of witches got.
Yeah.
Forever until very recently, because at least in that crazy world, you have this polar setup of witches with the good ones and the bad ones. But in your book, you've introduced this world, really and I want to drill down in just a second and ask you about this character. But the very basic concept is that this professor who has kind of a wandering eye and is fairly recently divorced and in his mid-40s, he is enticed by this super hot college administrator, which is such a wonderful concept. And he after he has this sexual encounter with this random super hot college administrator, very quickly it sets in motion this sort of domino set of events of first demon children, and then a giant sort of and then it inserts itself into this kind of world deconstruction where this demon child that they bear is going to be the linchpin to changing the entire world as regarding these demons. And it's fascinating. And it all involves two things. On the physical plane, the literal story, it involves trees and demons and legends. But subtextually, it involves what I just found really fascinating, this desperate, sad, erotic longing on the part of middle-aged men. And so I want to go back and ask you about this a little bit. And you've created this character, Rudy, who is a professor, and you describe him as a man who is bouncing every day between 2 or 3 different universities. That each sort of drives among. He drives a beat-up old Toyota. And what I thought was funny is how first of all, where are these? You said you're in Pennsylvania, so actually it kind of makes sense to me now that this could be Pennsylvania. But to be honest, it could be almost any metropolitan area where you've got a bunch of suburban universities around. Because I got kind of a New England feel from it. But,
absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, because of the oldness and the driving around and the bridges, and you do a very, very good job of describing this universe that he's driving around in. I found it very evocative, and I could totally picture this universe. But I want to ask you about this loser main character because I really identified with him. I thought it was cool that he kind of takes for granted that this is his lot in life, that he's going to drive from university to university, he's going to teach, he's kind of cynical, he doesn't kid himself about the beautiful students, and yet he is plagued constantly with this erotic longing. There's constantly this need to act out in ways that you would think that, when you're in your mid-40s, you no longer, you're going to be more mature than that. And you actually kind of have a line about that. So go ahead. Yeah, tell me how you wound up with this character.
You actually gave such a great character portrait of Rudy. The adjuncting thing, they call it adjuncting. Most of your lower level classes are actually taught by professors that don't have doctorates. Your Comp 101 and your Comp 102, which is what Rudy teaches, are taught by part-timers. And many of them do bounce between universities, and the pay isn't very good, but the job is really good. You don't have too many of those awful meetings, but when you do have one of those, it's probably the loneliest thing in the world. And I think that's where I started building Rudy, because I could share that because I'm an adjunct professor. And
there's been a lot of writing about that recently, right? People complaining that adjuncts, in a lot of universities, they're teaching the bulk of the students. They're what keeps the freshman and sophomore class afloat, and yet at the same time they don't necessarily have benefits. Maybe they
don't have a foothold. Yeah, right. They're part-time help, and they come in and they do their thing and they leave. And somebody like Rudy, who's in his 40s and who still has desires, is almost left on the fringe of life. Because in the end, all he really is responsible for, when you teach an English class, you talk about deep emotional things. That's how you make the connections with the students, and that's what Rudy is really good at. But he's also a perfectionist with language and stuff like that. He's kind of like a wannabe writer of scholarly articles, but he doesn't have the PhD behind it, can't really relate to people, because in the end, all he's responsible for is the grade. And then he's left almost as a non-entity. And my gosh, if you've ever been to one of these meetings, and they, the librarian talks about the newest feature that the library is using so you can access material, and they talk about state-mandated seat time, and they're very lonely and very boring. And then I thought, what can be the one thing that would spark this sucker up? And I thought of April Orr. And I thought, you have the hottest administrator ever, and all she's doing is looking at Rudy, and he hasn't been looked at in years.
Yeah.
And I thought there was a legitimacy to the loneliness and a legitimacy to his disbelief in what's happening. And then he ends up being her linchpin to free the rest of her race.
Yeah, it's almost a scam, except that it's only a scam in as much as this is what these demons do. And I keep calling them demons, I apologize, these witch. But it might be a scam, but it's also in her nature to become what a human wants and to twist their emotions. But you describe her so beautifully. I like how she's got, I think you said at the beginning, she has, if I recall, she has like a fringy yellow skirt and laced up witch boots, and it's such a university look. Honestly, it does sound like some sort of boho, living in an apartment, wearing a scarf kind of university girl.
Without a doubt.
Right. I mean, it fits perfectly. You can really see this character. And what one thing this reminds me of, you do very literary writing, but nevertheless, I read a lot of Stephen King. And one of the interesting things that he talked about, I think in Bag of Bones, all right, he talks about a character who's in his like 50s or something, and he's dating like this 30-year-old. And he has one of the other characters in the book say something that I think was intended to be a stand-in for King, where he said he didn't like to see these 50-something guys with young women, by which in this case he means a 30-year-old, because he says it was like looking at a person whose tongue is hanging out of their mouth even as their mouth is closed.
Right. Which is what Rudy is the most afraid of. And that's why it so amazes him that he has somebody that can get him out from behind that facade, because the only thing he has left at this point, he has his loneliness, and he has his adjuncting job and his crappy Toyota. And the only thing he has is that persona of wearing the mask and being that guy, the professor who always has the English answer. And, if you're going to be in his office and you're going to cry about something, he'll hand you a tissue, but he's not going to show any emotion. And you're absolutely right, Jason. It's not a scam, because April Orr turns into exactly what he needs. So it's the best moment of his life.
So let me ask you something though. Is it a mask? In other words, are you suggesting that the tongue is always hanging out of the mouth? In other words, the 40-something men are always masking these behaviors. And the reason I ask you if you feel that way is you do have this point in there where you say, I don't think you're talking about sex at the point, you're talking about something else, but you say that adults are just 14-year-olds who are pretending, or at least men are.
Oh, without a doubt, Jason. I'm not just saying it about 40-year-olds. I'm talking about 70-year-olds.
Right.
It's the same old stuff. That we have been implanted biologically with a sexual desire that is overwhelming And yeah, as Shakespeare said, it gets tamed after the. I think Hamlet says it to his mom. He says, "Isn't the blood supposed to be tamed by now?" And she's still going after his uncle. Yeah,
right. Right. No, and the uncle also. Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely right. But I always believed when I was a kid. Certainly this plays out most dangerously in sex, and so it's probably the thing that somebody like Rudy and a lot of us probably hide the most, because it's the thing that would be most embarrassing if people saw you. Like in this case, he's very concerned that this girl at the university doesn't see him staring at her breasts, right? Even though he's staring at her breasts, he's really trying to hide it. He's not a human who could not stare at her breasts. He is instead a human who wants to but has to hide it. But I always believed about this and about other stuff. When I was a kid, I was like, well, I'm all screwed up now. I'm always worried about what people think of me now. But when I'm 42 or 45, I actually at the time thought 35 because I thought, fuck, I can't get any older than 35.
Right, and you're thinking by 40, I got to have a shut-off valve.
Right.
I'm not going to feel this. I'm not going to be crazy.
Oh, good. Sorry.
You're thinking, yeah, by the time I'm 40, I'm not even thinking this. I'm not even feeling this, and that's just baloney.
It is baloney.
It's just baloney. People are passionate till the day they die. And you know what, Jason? That's what Witch is. It's about passion.
Yeah.
And Rudy's really passion ends up filtering into other things besides sex. I mean, if it was just sex, then it would be, a novel that's erotica. But the erotica is the starting point. He
really does want to be good. He wants to be a good professor. He strikes me as almost priestly pure in that sense, that he has complete cynicism about the dumbass things the university says to the adjuncts and all that stuff. But he really does like, what he does. Okay, I want to ask you. I want to change course and ask you about his relationship with his ex-wife. So he, as he gets involved with the repercussions of this sexual relationship with a witch/demon that has caused a demon baby to come into the world, his ex-wife is back in his life. And one thing that you harp on a lot, at least early on, is how little he can forgive her for aging. And I found it fascinating, and I didn't know what to make of it. I don't know if we, the reader, are supposed to think Rudy is a dumbass because he resents her. I mean, you can feel it. It just drips with resentment that her chin has collapsed and her cheeks have gotten fat and she hasn't kept her legs skinny. And it just is, it angers him in a palpable way.
Right, that's a tough and that's a tough sell. And I needed that to make the story work, but if it doesn't work for the character and all of a sudden we don't like Rudy, it's not going to work. What I was hoping is that it wasn't just the looks, because that's the thing that his demon child Wolfie says. Wolfie defends the ex-wife and says she's beautiful. You just don't recognize it because you're a man. But there's more than that. I think what I wanted to do with the ex-wife, without creating too much of a parody, I wanted the thing that really enraged Rudy the most is that she equates hobbies with his writing simply because he's never published anything. And that's something that I felt more people could relate to. I know I can. That when you're sitting in a room and somebody says, I can tie a knot and rope, and I've been practicing, and I got really good. I'm in a club, and hubby here, he writes his cute little articles, and Rudy, when he writes these things, trying to publish them, he works incredibly hard. So I found the dislike for Patricia is more of a professional thing, actually, and more of a pride thing. That I think that the growing old just didn't help. And
no, but you're totally right. I since we're talking about that, I do remember a lot of that where he just can't believe that she would say that. Now I've experienced that. So I'm a writer. You're a writer. And we've often experienced this where people go, so what do you do, what else do you do besides your day job or whatever? And you go, I do some writing here and there. I almost, to be honest with you, I almost don't tell them that I write. I would almost rather people believe that I lead the most boring life possible, they have to talk to them about writing. Because I don't want to talk about it to anybody except other writers,
Exactly, because you want to talk about the stuff that goes on behind the scenes, like how you came up with an image that became the jewel of a piece. And they don't care about the shit in the sink. They just want to see what's on the table.
That's totally right.
Which is why it's so much fun talking to you right now. Because you're asking questions that are just so cool. And I'm glad people are listening and they get to hear the answers to the questions. But your family is probably the toughest ones to show your writing to, because not only.
I can't do that. Do you do that? Do you show your writing to? I'm not saying that I wouldn't, but I don't generally, mainly because they just don't have any interest in it. But I mean, do you? Who reads your stuff? Like, okay, you have a great idea tonight. You go sit down and you fire off three chapters,
right?
Like 3,000 words you got on, and so it's like however many pages that would be, like 10 or 12 pages, and so I got the beginning of something. Here's 10 or 12 pages. Who do you share that with?
Okay, are you ready? My sister's also a writer, but she doesn't get it until the final draft. She's too critical. I do the worst thing. I take it to my dad, who doesn't understand horror, and his reaction is always, and then I get mad as hell, and then I make it better, and then I publish it somewhere.
No, that's probably good. In other words, you'd rather an audience of strangers.
Without a doubt. And my mom died a couple of years ago, but she was the worst critic of all, because everything I wrote was about her. Everything. I see myself in her in here, Michael. What kind of message are you sending me? That kind of thing.
Well, Orson Scott Card, who I know we're not supposed to love anymore because he's a big homophobe, but I have taught from Orson Scott Card's book on several of them. He wrote several really great books on writing books. Mm-hmm. And one thing that he wrote that I always struggled with and tried to figure out how I felt about it was, don't write anything you wouldn't want your mom to see. And what he was talking about was language, graphic sex, graphic violence, stuff like that. And I have veered way the fuck away from that, where I've written really bad stuff that my mom shouldn't have seen, because of course everybody's mother, even baby boomers, were apparently virgins. But
Jason, I would write exactly the opposite of what Mom wants if you want to publish something. Oh my God!
Right, no, you're probably right.
That's the funniest thing I ever heard.
But
write anti-Mom and you'll get published.
I've thought about this a lot. Where the whole notion of do I can't believe that I've actually thought about this, but I've often struggled with that. Do I want my mom reading this? Now, mind you, I've sold a bunch of books along the way, but it is something that I think about a lot. Is how do I? Which is crazy, because your parents are just two people out of a whole universe that you want reading the book. But I do worry about graphic violence. I worry about graphic sex. I worry about language, which is nuts. I grant you, but it is it is there.
My mother would not have liked Witch of the Wood. My dad actually liked it.
That's I mean, and there's some graphic violence. There's graphic violence for sure. There's also graphic sex, and there's weird sex, man. One guy who gets hit by a bus is having a very strange masturbatory fantasy. I don't want to go into it because I don't want to spoil it for people, but there's just some weird stuff. And that's because these various magical characters have the ability to affect the fantasies that you're having.
But isn't that why that's why erotica is going to sneak into all the genres mix. I mean, I think every story is a horror story. If it doesn't have a peril and nobody's asking if I don't do this, what'll happen, then it's not a story. It's a question of spice. And when you talk about erotica, if you're going to write the same sex scene over and over again, sure, you'll have your readers. But the time when those scenes are important are when you talk about the weirdness and the uncomfortableness, and it's still a hot scene.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially, there's a scene that is really right out of a Chinese ghost story in the beginning, when he first has his assignation with this girl who turns out to be a what they call a witch, they go to a house that later on turns out to actually be kind of a ruin, and that's such a wonderful tradition that it's a trope that can be found in, you can find it in oral legend, you can find it in novels and short stories, you can find it in Chinese and Western work. Mm-hmm. I thought that was really cool. It was very neat to bring in this folkloric aspect. Why? I want to ask you this, and then we should probably wrap up. But why do you do horror? Because I read off a bunch of your stuff, which is mostly short stories and novellas. And why horror?
It's funny. If I've ever joined like one of those writing classes where everybody's writing just realistic fiction, they all my stuff is usually hated more than any, because it's almost like I'm asking PTA members how they feel about a really well-written piece of pornography. I mean, that's an analogy, but that's the feeling that you get. And then also, it's tough to write horror on the other side, because I don't think I write horror. I write character-driven and I hope good plot-driven stuff that has a horror element. And a lot of horror experts say that I'm not horror. So I'm kind of damned if I do and damned if I don't. And then at the end of the day, I have to write what excites me. I mean, Jason, I could write the story, about how, Bill better ask Buffy out to the prom by lunch, or else Biff Malibu's going to ask her first. But the story gets so much more interesting for me if he's hid a dozen roses in the broom closet and there's a ghoul hiding behind the mops and the floor polishers. All of a sudden the story jumps out for me. That extra element, you get to mess with timelines when you have the supernatural and stuff like that. And you get to put people in moral situations they wouldn't normally be in, and you get to see the real them. And for me, that's
absolutely.
where the excitement is.
And I also think there's a commercial aspect to introducing the horror element that is really useful. If you're going to show me a story about 5 sisters that are getting together for a long weekend because their mother just died and they have to divide up all the crap in this attic and blah blah, something better blow up, man. There's no way I'm going to watch this thing unless
you don't want to see them knit a quilt and talk and.
Holy crap! I mean, but on the other hand, there are other people who go, "Wow, that thing you just described, can I go see that right now?" Because that is, believe me, some people dig that thing. So yeah, I don't know. I found it to be a very, very literary book, although it's certainly hard. There's so much gore. There's so much. The sex could be either way, but the gore and the mysticism was very straight up. But at the same time, it's a very literate horror. Now, let me ask you a technical question real quick, and then I know we're going to wrap up.
Okay.
You adopt in this book what I would call it's an omniscient narrator that occasionally gets glued very, very severely to one character for a long time. But essentially, it's an omniscient narrator because you'll go from one head to the other. You'll start with somebody and you go, he got really close to somebody else. That person was lining up his sight down the block, and then you're in that person's head. And you're going to follow them for a while. I dig that. There's nothing new with that. Shirley Jackson did that all the time. Jane Austen did that all the time. They don't do it all the time these days, though. I found that nowadays that kind of narrator that does head hopping like that is kind of unusual. Did you give any thought to that, or is this just too inside, or you never get it?
No, it's not too inside. For the most part, it's a third-person limited narrative, but at times the thing had to drift because there is a mysticism there. And I figured that I'm not going to sacrifice mysticism to stay true to a convention.
Right.
I'm a big believer. I'm sorry, Jason?
Well, I was just thinking, and it totally is a convention where where nowadays, editors will go, we only have one point of view. There will be no other points of view unless you are in a different book or in a different, and it's almost religious, which is very strange to me.
Yeah.
But
yeah, and there's another of these conventions that's jumped up in the last 7 or 8 years where a lot of editors won't read anything in first person, which I never really understood. I guess
I didn't know that.
I hear that a lot. But then again, when you look at writing guidelines, sometimes they're really odd. Like, you are not allowed to write if there's a cat in your lap. We can tell. All these odd things. And for the last 6-7 years, I've heard a lot of talk about no first person because it's too easy, which is ridiculous because it's just as good as third person limited. And I've also heard a lot of you can't do narrative summary. Everything has to be a direct scene. And no, it's a dance between the two. And
absolutely. This whole show don't tell, it just depends on the senior end. There are certain things, believe me, that are way better telling.
Right. Right. And I think that in the end, and I don't want to take up all your time, man. Well, I could. I can talk for another hour. I told you I like to talk.
Yeah. No, for sure.
But in the end, the story comes first. And if you're going to break a rule, story comes first. And if the point of view floated a little bit, it's because some of the story floats like little campfire ashes.
Well, I wasn't actually thinking of it as a critique. I just found it really interesting. Like, for instance, the point where the guy has the very strange sexual dream by the bus stop. Rudy's standing near that guy, and so you flow from Rudy to that guy's head as he has his memory. Now, Rudy is actually seeing that vision.
Yes,
so
I gave myself an excuse.
Yeah. But in a sense, what you've done is you've had the camera follow a different character. I really dig that. I think it's fine, and I wish people would try this stuff more. I mean, I find all of these sort of hard and fast conventions to be, tiresome, honestly. So. Yeah,
and one of the things that I experiment with in a lot of my stories is the idea that you could be inside somebody else. The idea of empathy is always so fascinating to me because then you get the other point of view. Because everybody thinks they're a good guy.
Does Rudy end up getting empathy for? Because I haven't finished it, but Wolfie says, you need to recognize this and that about your ex-wife, and does Rudy end up ever sort of forgiving her for the things that have infuriated him about her?
I don't know if I can say that, but there's recognition.
Yeah. Well, maybe
yeah.
As good as it gets.
That loose end will be tied up.
Good. All right, outstanding. Michael, I really appreciate it. Tell me where we can find this book.
Okay, it's on Amazon. So if you go into The Witch of the Wood, it'll come up Aronovitz, and it's available on Kindle for like $6, and then they have. The prices fluctuate on Amazon. I think you can get it for like $16 in paperback. But all of my books, you could also go to the Hippocampus site. But if you just do the http ://michaelaronovitz.com, I just got a banging website done. It was a long time in coming and planning, and it's called The Author's Graveyard, and it has that up there on a sticky post as my feature book. I have a blog going in there, and all of my books are on there, so michaelaronovitz.com.
Very cool. And Hippocampus, excellent publisher. They specialize in H.P. Lovecraft, and that's sort of I think what they're most known for is all this Lovecraft stuff. And this book really fits into that very, very well. That feel of just that sort of New England spooky countryside feel. Very awesome. I was really happy to talk to you, and I really enjoyed Witch of the Wood. Have a fantastic evening, everybody. We will see you next week with more look at the increasingly horrible Poltergeist series. And, Michael, thank you. Don't be a stranger. We'll talk soon.
Thanks, Jason. Bye-bye.
Bye.